Order. Order. We now come to the backbench debate on the Beijing Winter Olympics and Chinese government sanctions. I intend to put the time limit up to 7 minutes to start with and see how we go on. It may have to be reduced, but we'll try that to start with. Tim Loughton to move.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I presume that doesn't apply to me, but I beg to move that this House believes that the 2022 Winter Olympic Games should not be hosted in a country whose government is credibly accused of mass atrocity crimes, and calls on the UK government to decline invitations for its representatives to attend the 2022 Beijing Olympic Games unless the government of the People's Republic of China ends the atrocities taking place in the Xinjiang region and lifts the sanctions imposed on UK parliamentarians, citizens and entities. I think I must first declare an interest, Madam Deputy Speaker, as one of the sanctioned, and I wear my badge of honour today, although any financial interest I would have had to declare would no doubt have been frozen by the Chinese government. But can I thank the Backbench Business Committee for giving us time for what is a very important subject. As a spotty school student back in 1980, I proposed a motion at a local school debating competition that the UK government should not boycott the Moscow Summer Olympics following their invasion of Afghanistan over the previous Christmas, and that politics should be kept out of sport. As it turned out, Mrs Thatcher, the Prime Minister at the time, recommended a boycott, but it was left up to the individual sporting bodies as to whether they sent athletes from their sports to the Games, and those that did compete did so under the Olympic flag, and the few gold medals that we did win were collected to the strains of the choral cantata that is the Olympic anthem. My overriding memory of those Olympic Games was the image of Daley Thompson emotionally collecting his decathlon gold medal and belting out God Save the Queen to the tune of the rather dreary Olympic hymn. 65 countries carried out a full boycott of the 1980 Olympics, including such strange bedfellows as the US and Iran, Israel and Saudi Arabia, and China. China condemned the Russians, sent no athletes, and subsequently did not appear on the medal table. So China really doesn't have a leg to stand on when it finds itself on the end of the same treatment that it meted out to its neighbour back in 1980. Now, my view on sporting boycotts and keeping politics out of sport has not changed, and that's why this motion is not calling for a fall sporting boycott, which victimises most the elite athletes who dedicate so much to compete every 4 years, however niche the UK's medal prospects might be at the Winter Olympics compared with the summer version. But the simple reality, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that in this day and age, sport is inextricably linked and is often tainted by politics, whether we like it or not, and that taint, at some times, can come no greater when the event is hosted under the Olympic banner. Most countries will bid for the honour of hosting the Olympics so they can showcase their nation to the world as an impressive player on the world stage, a land of progress and plenty where everything is just rosy and all the criticisms you hear about them are just baseless propaganda. And I'm sure we were guilty of some of that when London hosted the 2012 Olympics, and especially in the visually and financially extravagant opening and closing ceremonies, which reminded the world why the United Kingdom is the top nation. The difference was that our people were free to criticise that extravaganza if they disapproved. Our press were free to caricature or lampoon it, as some did, especially Paul McCartney's singing. And we in this place were free to tackle ministers about whether it was money well spent and whether we actually wanted it. In the same way that when honourable and right honourable members in this House are free to speak out against abuses at home or abroad, human rights or otherwise, as freely happened, including the recent reports by both the Bays and Foreign Affairs Select Committees on the Uyghur situation. In the same way that this House has spoken out about the grotesque oppression, torture and murder of over 1 million peace-loving Tibetans at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party since the occupation of 1959. In the same way we have called out the industrial-scale human rights abuses against the Uyghur people, the slave labour camps in Xinjiang, the forced sterilisation of Uyghur women, all leading to a motion unanimously passed in this House on April the 22nd, thanks to the good services of my honourable friend from Wealden, which called out these inhuman acts for what they are, namely genocide, and committed by the hand of the Chinese Communist Party government, who in just 200 days' time will be welcoming the world to the temporary mirage that is a free Beijing. As the goose-stepping battalions of the People's Liberation Army take ownership of the Olympic rings and run the Olympic flag up their flagpole. Any dissent, any protest, any adverse publicity will be cancelled, crushed, and disappeared. Just as the Chinese government tried to suppress the free speech that is the hallmark of parliamentary democracy, and to bully 5 members of this House, including me, and 2 noble lords, by responding to our expose of their abuses by sanctioning us in the misguided belief that we would shut up and go away. And now we are apparently to be subject to China's new counter-foreign sanctions law too. Of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, the opposite was true. We have been louder than ever. The crimes of the Chinese government have been under more scrutiny in this place and beyond, as China's counterproductive miscalculation of what democracy actually counts for in the West has instead acted as a recruiting sergeant for decent people across the globe determined to call the Chinese government out for the murderous bully it really is. We should be in no doubt about the real agenda behind China's enthusiasm to host the Olympics for the second time. The Chinese propaganda machine is being ratcheted up for this historic event, which will make the Chinese capital the first city to host both the summer and winter Olympic Games. The spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Wang Wenbin, has been boasting that the majority of countries and people in the world recognise the fact that China's human rights conditions are constantly improving and China has achieved notable progress in its human rights cause, a claim that would embarrass even the Iraqi spokesman, Comical Ali, of Gulf War notoriety. We know what they will use the Winter Olympics for, as they showed quite clearly at the Summer Olympics in Beijing of 2008. They proudly boasted, with 105 heads of state and government there, it was the largest gathering of world leaders for a sporting event in world history, until 2012, that is. The People's Liberation Army Navy Band performed the nationalistic Welcome March and goose-stepped across the arena. 56 Chinese children, representing supposedly the 56 ethnic groups of ethnic China in their respective costumes, danced across the arena to the strains of Ode to the Motherland, lip-synced by a 9-year-old to the pre-recorded voice of another girl who had been told she was not pretty enough to appear on the stage. And to add insult to injury, it later turned out that all 56 of those children claiming to be representatives of China's diversity were in fact all Han Chinese. The spectacular $100 million opening ceremony lasted 4 hours and 9 minutes, as the 91,000 audience enjoyed a panoply of everything Chinese. They saw everything the Chinese Communist Party wanted them and the rest of the world to see, and indeed that was made easier by the notorious use of weather modification technology to prevent clouds and rain, just one of the more extreme examples of the Chinese Communist Party manipulating the environment. It was fated as a spectacular and unforgettable ceremony. The spectacular to end all spectaculars and probably can never be bettered, in the mesmerised words of one Tony Blair. But it was all a sham. The awarding of the 2008 Olympics to Beijing was accompanied by the International Olympics Committee promising that the Games would act as a catalyst for human rights reform in China. While a widely acknowledged genocide in Xinjiang later, thousands of Tibetans arrested, imprisoned, displaced, tortured and killed later, the snuffing out of free speech, free press and political freedoms in Hong Kong, and the trashing of the Sino-British Joint Declaration and imposition of the national security law later, that went well, didn't it? To help win the 2008 Olympics, China promised to allow space for Chinese citizens to protest during the Games. Spaces were indeed allocated, but those who applied for permission to protest were in fact arrested, making a mockery of the undertakings to the IOC, and no doubt the same will happen next February, again, as China remains the world's largest jailer of journalists. The Chinese authorities... Oh, of course I will.
I'm delighted to be here listening to this extremely important speech that the honourable member is making. Would he also just recall that we had our own contribution to the silencing of debate, sadly, at the time of the Olympics, and that was the Olympics in London, when some of the so-called guards of the Olympic flame turned out actually to be operatives from the Ministry of State Security and dealt with citizens in this country, individuals in this country, rather more brutally than we would ever tolerate of our own police.
I'm afraid it's absolutely right, and furthermore to that, I remember mentioning in this House the fate of Tibetans who had been protesting, I think in the Mao, who were arrested, who were stuck behind crowds, and in some cases had their homes raided by the police and were arrested before they could go and protest as well. That's not the way we do things in this country, and yet for some reason we kowtowed to the Chinese authorities at that stage. That must never be repeated, and we must not resile from calling out those sorts of tactics that the Chinese will use in their own country and wherever they can gain influence. I'll give way to my right hand.
I'm grateful. I was just reflecting on his earlier comments, my own friend's comments, and they were about the Olympics in Beijing. We were told in 2008, as I recall, that the awarding of the Olympics would be a key moment in the movement of getting China to acknowledge and to uphold human rights to a greater degree. That was in 2008. Does he think they've made much progress since then?
Exactly the point I've been labouring to make. It was all a sham, and we all know how human rights in China have gone from bad to worse. The Chinese authorities also, back ahead of 2008, had to clean up the environment around Beijing, as it looked at one stage as if everyone would have to compete in masks. 13 years on, China remains the world's largest polluter, responsible for some 26% of the planet's greenhouse gas emissions. It's burnt more coal over the last 11 years than the rest of the world put together, and now imperils the world's third pole, the Tibetan Plateau glaciers that service the water needs of billions of people. And of course, the energy needed to produce artificial snow in Beijing for the winter sports, which they will need to do, will not exactly win any environmental award. So, like it or not, Madam Deputy Speaker, China will make this global sporting event a global political spectacle. It's incredible, frankly, that the Winter Games were awarded to China again in the first place, a sign of a much too cosy relationship between the Chinese government, the IOC, and its President Thomas Bach, who during President Xi's visit to the IOC headquarters in Lausanne back in 2017 claimed that he wanted to give the Chinese president a set of medals because he is the true Olympic champion for the youth. Yuck. But on virtually every level, the awarding of the Games to China should never have happened. It flies in the face of the Olympic principles as encoded in the Olympic Charter by the IOC. Olympism seeks to create a way of life based on the joy of effort, the educational value of good example, social responsibility, and respect for universal fundamental ethical principles. The goal of Olympism is to place sport at the service of the harmonious development of humankind with a view to promoting a peaceful society concerned with the preservation of human dignity. Sports organisations within the Olympic movement shall apply political neutrality. They have the rights and obligations of autonomy, which include freely establishing and controlling the rules of sport, determining the structure and governance of their organisations, enjoying the right of elections free from any outside influence, and the enjoyment and the rights and freedoms set forth in this Olympic Charter shall be secured without discrimination of any kind, such as race, colour, sex, sexual orientation, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status. How on earth does a genocidal, industrial-scale, human rights abusing, free speech intolerant and planet vandalising regime square with those principles?
It doesn't.
In 2017, Xi Jinping claimed the international Olympic movement, in its over 100 years, has played a positive role in enhancing all-round human development, deepening friendship between nations, and promoting peace, development, and progress. Everything that China has done since then and is still doing makes a mockery of that claim if the Beijing Olympics are allowed to go ahead in the form that the Chinese Communist Party wants, and its behaviour is allowed to be normalised, and they are allowed to score the major soft power propaganda victory they crave. That's why, Madam Deputy Speaker, that a motion passed by this House urging a diplomatic boycott is so important. emphasising that again, that we will not turn a blind eye to industrial-scale human rights abuses, and hopefully impressing on the government the need to enact such a boycott so that no ministers, diplomats, royal family members and other VIPs dance to the tune of the Chinese Communist Party, and the loss of face that they will suffer will show how serious the United Kingdom is. To date, the Chinese government has taken no notice. Just last week, the Chinese tech giant Tencent's WeChat social media platform deleted dozens of LGBT accounts, sparking fears of a crackdown on gay content online and gay rights generally. Again, in defiance of Olympic principles and echoing the actions of Russia suppressing LGBT organisations ahead of the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics. I will.
I'm grateful, and I apologise for missing the first few seconds of what is a very powerful speech, with which I agree with every word he's said, and he's completely right that the Chinese government intend to use these Winter Olympics as a propaganda exercise. Does he agree with me that it should be possible to turn this round if we, and I just put this forward as an example, we start referring to these Winter Olympics as something like the Genocide Games?
I think that would, if they're going to go ahead, that would be a very effective label to put on them to reinforce the point. I think the honourable gentleman makes a fair point. But back to the LGBT point I was making, remember that homosexuality was classified as a mental disorder in China until 2001. And earlier this year, a Chinese court upheld a university's description of homosexuality as a psychological disorder. How does that square with those principles, again, I quoted in the Olympic Charter? And there are also fears that Beijing merchandise will be made with Uyghur forced labour, and I hope that the British sponsors of the Games will have no truck with this if they continue to offer sponsorship, and some pressure might be applied there. But Madam Speaker, in bringing this motion before the House today, we are not alone. Through the good services of IPAC, the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, and other like-minded organisations, motions are being put before the US House of Representatives, parliaments in Germany, Canada, Italy, Czechia, Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, Lithuania, and others. And on June the 8th, the European Parliament passed a resolution calling on Member States and the Commission to decline invitation to the Games in the absence of human rights improvement. For once, the EU did the right thing and voted for that unanimously. The US Secretary of State, Blinken, has already mooted a diplomatic boycott which has incurred the wrath of China, whilst Congressman Tom Malinowski of the House Foreign Affairs Committee has said the International Olympic Committee should not be validating the Chinese government's international standing, whilst that government is committing genocide and crimes against humanity. This coordinated effort by legislatures in multiple democratic countries sends a message that the IOC cannot ignore. If it can discuss postponing the Tokyo Games over public health concerns, it can certainly move the China Games over the mass incarceration of millions in concentration camps. In return, when celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist regime earlier this month, President Xi, of course, cheerily threatened that any foreigners attempting to influence China will have their heads bashed against the Great Wall of Steel. Madam Deputy Speaker, President Xi can bash away all he likes, but this House must not and will not be bowed. This House will soon be invited to vote on a motion calling for the UK government to institute a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics, and I hope that honourable and right honourable members vote yes, and that the government acts on that strong hint. But it must mean something, and it must lead to more action and consequences for China's behaviour beyond just a 16-day sporting event in February. The Foreign Secretary has been robust in his condemnation of industrial-scale human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and the sanctions against a small number of officials and the restrictions on businesses dealing in Xinjiang are welcome, but they must be just a small start to a much broader programme of tangible action coordinated with our allies who champion democracy and human rights. Today I've retabled my Tibet Reciprocal Access Bill, extended to apply to Xinjiang too. The US Congress unanimously passed the bill on which it's based. Why can't we? Earlier we heard concerns about the proposed Chinese takeover of the UK's largest semiconductor producer, which must surely be blocked under the powers the government has under the new National Security and Investment Act. And coming to an end now, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I know you want me to, the latest move makes it even more imperative that we have a full holistic audit of the throttling grip that the many tentacles of the Chinese state is taking in British boardrooms on British research and infrastructure projects, on British university campuses and in British classrooms? When will the notorious Chen Guangzhou, the architect of oppression in Tibet and genocide in Xinjiang, be added to the sanction list along with other Chinese Communist Party officials and politicians? But, Madam Deputy Speaker, acting on this motion today is not a discretionary option. It is an imperative, and we are duty-bound legally. The UK is a party to the Genocide Convention. All state parties to the Genocide Convention are under an obligation to refrain from taking an active part in the crime of genocide, and additionally to prevent the commission of genocide by others using all means reasonably available and within their power. This includes situations where one state alone will be unable to prevent genocide, but where its actions in combination with the efforts of others may do so. A diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics is a measure available to the UK that may contribute to preventing genocide being committed in the Xinjiang region. This is precisely because the Olympics has been identified as a key pressure point on China, and China is seeking to use the Olympics to portray a positive image to the world and has already threatened a robust response to the suggestion that US diplomats might decline to attend. Such comments reveal China's acute sensitivity to the spotlight a diplomatic boycott would shine on its human rights abuses and highlight the corresponding leverage and that the international community has. So we're therefore under an obligation to prevent and punish the crime of genocide as set down in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This House has already determined that this is a very credible case that exists, carried out by the Chinese government against the Uyghur people in Xinjiang, and it amounts to crimes against humanity and the crime of genocide. In passing this motion today, we are therefore fulfilling our obligations and doing our job. I very much hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Minister will confirm that the Government will now be taking its obligation seriously and doing its job by implementing the terms of this motion, and I beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper. We now go to Asfal Khan by video link.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I thank the Honourable Member for East Worthing and Shoreham for securing this debate and for his excellent and powerful speech. The repression of Uyghur Muslims by the Chinese government has a long and a dark history. But in the last few years, the Chinese government has ramped up its persecution of Uyghurs. It is estimated that more than 1 million people are being held at the internment camps in Xinjiang, and the Chinese government are showing no sign of pausing their haunting campaign. Yet, despite condemnation from all sides of the House, including the government, there is still a gaping chasm between rhetoric and action. We cannot, on the one hand, recognize genocide, and on the other, send dignitaries and diplomats to the Beijing Olympics. We must be robust in our condemnation and send a message to the Uyghur Muslims that we are on their side. Calls for a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics are gaining momentum internationally. It is high time that the UK demonstrates leadership on this issue and follows on the footsteps of the EU and America to send a strong message to the international community that the UK condemns the shocking human rights abuses taking place in Xinjiang and indeed in Hong Kong. We cannot let Chinese detract attention away from international criticism of its human rights abuses and repressive policies. Madam Deputy Speaker, a diplomatic boycott is a very basic ask. And frankly, we shouldn't even be having a debate on this. Out of sheer principle, the UK government must support a boycott and press China to allow the UN unfettered access to conduct an independent investigation. Additionally, there are many more practical and much needed steps that government can take. Could the Minister outline what steps the government is taking in response to those parliamentarians who have been sanctioned by the Chinese government? And will the Minister also provide an update on further Magnitsky sanctions for those committing human rights abuses in Xinjiang? The government should also be investigating claims that UK universities could be inadvertently supporting the development of facial recognition and surveillance technologies that are then used by the Chinese government in the oppression of Uyghur people. Could the minister update the House on what representation he has made to the UK universities on this matter? In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, the point isn't that the UK withdrawing sport from a sporting event. It is about condemning the ongoing crimes against humanity taking place in Xinjiang. It is about ensuring that the UK supply chains are not linked to the forced Uyghur labor. It is about making sure that Chinese companies complicit in the surveillance of Uyghurs in Xinjiang aren't sponsoring research in British universities. It is about taking a stand, which I hope, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that after today's timely debate will be taken. Thank you.
Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat.
Hear, hear. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's a great privilege to speak in this debate, and it echoes some of the comments that the committee I'm privileged enough to chair, and where one fellow member of the committee is here with us today, were able to put into a report that we published only a few days ago, Never Again, the UK's responsibility to act on atrocities in Xinjiang and beyond. And in it, we looked at the Olympics, as my honourable member, the member for Worthing, has put it, because, of course, it asks some very specific questions of us. It's not just that it's a global event and therefore an opportunity for PR, if you like, for awareness, for broadcast, for propaganda even. But it's because actually the Olympics are much more than that. Their origins, before they were, of course, reinvented in the 19th century, but their origins go back to the idea of competition as an avoidance of war. Their origins go to the origins, indeed, of our own civilizations, emerging as they did from the great Greek city-states. And what they did was they set, in a constructive and organised fashion, a set of rules, a set of structures that allowed people to compete equally and fairly amongst each other. It's a huge achievement. It's quite a remarkable achievement when you think how early it happened. It took a long time before we saw that same competition in trade, in ideas, in innovation, in technology, in a peaceful fashion in our world. In fact, it really only emerged after the last war. It really only emerged in the last 80 years and only really came to its fruition since the fall of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet occupation of so much of the world. It's quite a remarkable achievement that in 30 years we have been competing on the basis of rules and not of force. And so this event really does matter. Because this event reinforces that point, that the rules matter. Fairness matters. Equal opportunity matters. Access matters. Voice matters. And the truth matters. And sadly, my honourable friend has already cited so many areas where the truth points in a direction that Beijing wishes it didn't. Now, that's a great shame. It's a great shame not just for the people of China, who are, of course, the first prisoners of the Chinese Communist Party. It's not just a shame for the people of the region, who, of course, suffer from the numerous abuses and indignities that the Chinese state has been imposing upon them. It's actually a shame for the entire world. It's a shame for us here in this country, despite the freedoms we enjoy and the luxuries we are blessed with. Because we lose out. We lose out on the ability to share equally and fairly with a people that has given the world so much. 5,000 years of amazing civilization emerging from that extraordinary plateau around the Yangtze Valley, from that emergence of ideas, of people, of culture, of economics. What wealth came from those people? What ideas have the people of China given humanity? What richness have we enjoyed from their imaginations, from their minds, from their freedoms? So we all lose when they lose. We all suffer when their ideals are stolen. We all suffer when their innovation is silenced, when their culture is curtailed. We all suffer when their voices are locked away. And that's what we're seeing today. Now, there are very few ways in which the UK can respond directly. It would be wrong, politically, militarily, economically, socially, culturally, to threaten force. It would be wrong to seek to punish individuals whose crime is simply to be citizens of a dictatorial state. They're already punished enough. That makes it very difficult to know how to respond. But one way we can respond is by standing up and making it clear that we do not accept the legitimacy of the regime. We do not accept its right to so change the truth, to so violate the reality of the world in which we live, that it can use the ultimate evidence, the ultimate moment of propaganda of the global success of rules, of fairness, of integrity, and twist it, contort it, divert it to its own nefarious aims. So I think we should attend the Games, but only as athletes. And at the moments when the Games have the propaganda element at the beginning or the end, we only need a single athlete to hold a single flag to make clear the point that the team stands together and against this tyranny. But in seeing that single individual, it would be clear to the world that Britain's voice is there and present, but not participating in the propaganda games that go with them. Now, these are going to be difficult decisions for the government because it has to factor in many different areas. And sometimes people say that gesture politics is no politics. Well, I would say no. I would say this is a gesture that does make a difference. It's a gesture that defends the rules that keep us all safe, that defends the cultures that keep us all free, and defends our own ability to cooperate fairly and to avoid conflict. The rules matter. They make us richer, they make us safer, they protect Britain, they protect our friends, and if they're allowed to, they will once again protect the people of China.
Vera Hoppas.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I too want to congratulate and thank the Right Honourable Member from East Worthing and Shoreham for securing his debate. He knows how much I support him in his very active campaigning in calling out the human rights abuses of the Chinese Communist Party against millions of its own people, and it is such a very important debate that we are having today. I don't want to repeat everything that has already been said, and indeed everything that has been said so far in this chamber I fully support. And we have already heard in today's debate about the significant and substantial evidence of the terrible treatment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. The arbitrary detention, mass incarceration, forced political indoctrination, re-education, and Orwellian levels of surveillance. Most horrifying are the accounts of sexual abuse, of torture, and of forcible sterilization. It is a pervasive assault on human rights. It must be challenged. We cannot stay silent. The UK has to do all that it can, working with our international partners, including the EU, and I listened very carefully to the Right Honourable Member who spoke, the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, about the limitations one has as a foreign state to intervene without, being strong without actually going as far as threatening force. But we do have this opportunity. It starts by calling it out for what it is, what we see, and it is a genocide. There's a clear evidence that this treatment of the Uyghur Muslims meets the legal definition of the crime of genocide, as set out under the Article 2 of the Genocide Convention and Article 6 of the Rome Statute. Parliament has recognised that this is the case, and now the government and us here must follow suit. We must continue our calls for investigation by the UN, by the ICC and by the ICJ, but we cannot afford to wait for these to happen. It is also vital that we take other meaningful steps to help stop these atrocities. We should work with our European allies in lockstep on sanctions and cooperate with them to expand the reach and scope of our Magnitsky sanctions regime. And this brings me to the topic of today's debate, the role of the Beijing Winter Olympics. We must bear in mind that the human rights abuses by the CCP, and I repeat, it is the CCP, and honourable members have said this many times, it is the Chinese Communist parties, it is not the people of China themselves who are committing these atrocities. I have already touched on the terrible crimes in Xinjiang. Remember that this is surrounded by a context of human rights abuses in places like Tibet, the CCP's attempt to dismantle democracy and liberty in Hong Kong, the rhetoric around Taiwan, which grows ever more dangerous, and the CCP's ongoing activities in the South China Sea in the face of UN rulings. Western countries have to make a stance. We must be aware that the Olympics next year will be used to give credibility, and we have heard this several times today already, credibility to the regime. Whether we like it or not, it will serve as a propaganda tool. It would be absolutely unacceptable for the Prime Minister, for the Foreign Secretary, or for senior diplomats and officials to give credibility to such an event. And if the Games do go ahead, it is vital that the IOC adjusts their own rules. Rule 50 of the Olympics Charter prevents athletes from speaking out, from making peaceful demonstrations or protests in the field of play or during medal ceremonies. It is totally unacceptable that competitors should be gagged in this way, under the threat of sanctions from the IOC if they do so. The justification for this rule is to keep politics out of sport, but as we have already heard, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is an event which will be used politically by the Chinese Communist Party. But the reality is that the protest-free games will be just as political as one in which athletes are allowed to express their opinions. Finally, we must also be realistic about whether it is at all appropriate for the Games to go ahead in Beijing, given the ongoing human rights abuses. And here, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I do want to go a little bit further. Is it at all justifiable that the Games go ahead? In grave circumstances such as these, it is vital that the options of a full sporting boycott of the Games remains at least on the table. There is growing consensus about the diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Winter Olympics, but I wonder whether we should dare to go further. Across the House, we are outraged about the horrific human rights abuses by the CCP against millions of its own people. The Chinese Communist, the critics become more and more aware, but the Chinese Communist Party becomes more and more emboldened the longer the rest of the world stands by. Let's now get real. Let's start today with supporting the motion in front of us. Thank you.
Duncan Smith.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's a pleasure to take part in this debate, and I thank my honourable friend for having brought this forward and been successful in doing so. I must explain, I should have said that I draw attention to my inclusions in the Register of Members' Interest. I do want to raise here, at this particular point, the importance of the fact that I had a discussion with the UK Olympic Committee last year, because I had been making a bit of a fuss about why we were holding these Olympics at that stage, and they asked to come and see me, which they did. And they asked me what was my position on it, and I just said, look, as far as I'm concerned, it's up to individual athletes as to what they choose to do. I would obviously like them to understand where they're going, what they're going to be involved in, but I do expect the government to take a position on this. And my view would be that the UK government, and this is really even before quite a lot of the stuff that we now know is coming out, that the UK government would take the view that attending, giving it diplomatic credibility, having UK officials, ministers, etc., attending these games is no longer feasible given the nature of this regime in China, the Chinese Communist Party. And their reaction to me was, We could live with that. We can understand that. That's fair. We weren't going to complain about that. We understand why you would do that and leave it to individual athletes. And so my view is this is even more reinforced by what we know. It is since that conversation, actually, that we've had the evidence of the abuses now laid bare by Adrian Zenz, who showed us that the Uyghur atrocity is really a genocide through the documentation that he produced, and which eventually we managed to publish through IPAC and some others institutions. We know now much more even now about the forced labour camps in Tibet, where we think close on over 2 million people are now in labour camps in Tibet, which a case that my honourable friend has due credit for having raised long after anybody else has ever cared to raise it again. And it goes on. We know that the Chinese government is aggressive abroad and aggressive at home. It has killed Indian soldiers on the border with India as it seeks to dispute the border. It has taken over the South China Seas against the UN's concerns, where they said they had no historic rights over that area. It has threatened and continues to threaten Taiwan. In fact, only today, as my honourable friend, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, was in part of this question that we had about the semiconductor company, which we know is being sold now to a Chinese company here from the UK. And it's interesting that one of the things that I didn't raise, but is the case now we know, that China has strategically said that semiconductor production must now come to China and they must dominate globally. But more importantly, they want to use it as a weapon against Taiwan, because Taiwan is probably the biggest single producer now of semiconductors. And China really wants to stop that cash flow to Taiwan as well. So one of the strategic reasons for wanting to take the UK company and essentially use it is to increase their own capability and stop Taiwan. So you can see there's not a single thing that this Chinese Communist Party does that has not been thought through to the final degree. They know where they're going. And they don't even hide it. As my honourable friend said, they threatened that anybody who affronts them would have their heads bashed against a wall of steel. And, you know, I don't recall that you say something like that and then everybody laughs. It's not... I mean, imagine if the British government was to say that about anybody that disagreed with it. We'd all be up in arms and everybody would be complaining around the free world. Yeah, I give way.
I'm delighted to support my honourable friend and the powerful speech he's making. Does he remember the words of the Chinese ambassador to Stockholm only a few months ago? For our friends, we have flowers and wine, and for our enemies, we have shotguns. Has he ever heard another diplomat use such language?
No, I haven't. I really haven't. And the funny thing about... He's absolutely right for raising it, because the funny thing about the Chinese government, President Xi says exactly what he's going to do. And the intriguing thing is he does it. And governments, I have to say, sadly, to some degree like my own and around the Western world, what do? They think actually he doesn't really mean it, and they wish that if he didn't mean it, that there would be a different outcome. And then they make stupid excuses like saying, do you know what? If we give them these games, 2018, they will uphold human rights. Did they? I don't recall that they did much of that. And then they say, don't worry, if we trade more with China in the golden decade, as my honourable friends did in the government of which I was a member, they will liberalise their politics and they will head towards democracy. I tell you who's naive in this. It's all of us. It's the Western democracies who actually set policy around what they wish would happen, and they don't remember history in the 1930s. We have forgotten what happened when we appeased another ghastly dictatorship. 60 million people died as a result of our failure when we appeased them, and we are bound on the same course today. And this debate today about boycotting these Olympics is not just a token. We know that China is sensitive when it gets global criticism, when people shine the torch on what goes on behind there. We know they react. Why do we know that? Because they sanction people like myself and many of my colleagues in this chamber and in the European Parliament. But the difference is, And I applaud the European Parliament and those who are members of IPAC who have been sanctioned. They have stopped the European Union having a trade arrangement as a result of that. What have we done? We now talk about doing more trade arrangements, and we sit here as sanctioned individuals. I want the government to act. So I have to say it is simply not good enough that we say with one hand we are horrified by what they do, and with the other we now make plans to seek more trade relationships with them, and we do not want to interfere in the Olympics. Everything is political in a communist regime. Every single aspect of your lives is governed by a communist political regime. Our government must recognise now that it is no longer dealing with a decent organisation that would uphold freedoms. It is dealing with a dictatorial, militaristic, intolerant, oppressive regime who, every time we give them these public demonstrations as the Olympics, we do ourselves and worse, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, and all those oppressed peoples, a disfavour. Let us stand up for freedom, democracy, and human rights and not back these games.
Video link. Navenu Mishra.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I want to start by thanking the Honourable Member for East Worthing and Shoreham for securing this important debate. The work he does alongside the Honourable Member for Dundee West on the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Tibet is vital in raising awareness around the human rights abuses committed by the Chinese government. I'm grateful that this debate has been called, but it is depressing that this even needs to be discussed at all. This Parliament has recognised that genocide is taking place against the Uyghurs in northwest China. The motion debated in April called on the government to act to fulfil its obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide and all relevant instruments of international law to bring it to an end. Yet here we are discussing whether it is acceptable for this country's athletes to participate in games held in a country committing these atrocities. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'd like to draw this House's attention to the situation in Tibet. At the last Olympics held in China in 2008, thousands of Tibetans took to the streets to protest and were brutally suppressed, with hundreds killed. Yet the full total of deaths remains unknown. Since then, we've seen the forced erosion of Tibetan culture, from the replacement of Tibetan language by Mandarin in schools to the repeated use of arbitrary detention and widespread torture. In addition to that, large religious communities have seen thousands of residents forcefully removed and their homes demolished. The rich Tibetan culture, Buddhist religion, and Tibetan language is being forcefully eroded, and freedom of thought, opinion, expression, religion, and consciousness not just being undermined, but it is being actively eradicated. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'd like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the organisation Free Tibet. The work they do in raising awareness about the oppression of the Tibetan people, culture and language should be placed on record. But it remains unacceptable that more has not been done by this government to call out these hideous abuses for decades. They've pursued a foreign policy of complacency that pans out as a foreign policy of complicity. Following the vote in April, where were the government sanctions against China? Why has the government not made a commitment to boycott these Olympics? What measures are being put in place to support those fleeing the oppression of the Chinese state? These are not just rhetorical questions, Mr. Deputy Speaker. They are points that should have been considered right back when these issues started to rear their ugly heads. These Winter Olympic Games provide a choice for this country to stand up for the oppressed people and human rights, or to turn a blind eye to atrocities. But shamefully, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this government's continued silence speaks 1,000 words. When HSBC Bank repeatedly refused to unfreeze the assets of Hong Kong activists, including one activist who fled to our country after crowdfunding for lawsuits against police brutality, did the government speak out? I'm sure we can all guess the answer. Now we have a chance to take an international stance determined by human rights, one that recognises people's rights to practice their religion freely, to worship, to express their views, and to use their language. I would urge the government to follow that path and call for a boycott of the Winter Olympic Games. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Video link. Mark Logan.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and also thank you to the member for East Worthing on securing this debate and to have the opportunity to follow on from a fellow Greater Manchester MP. When you say Olympics, it was me thinking about jumping hurdles, hitting archery targets, Usain Bolt breaking records, and our wonderful Team GB cycling team. But then I realized it wasn't Tokyo that we were on about today, but rather the Beijing and Hubei 2022 Winter Olympics. And you know what? I know absolutely nothing about the Winter Olympics. And yet here I am today speaking on a debate about it. Though I am comforted by observing that an absence of a background in something does not necessarily deter one from waxing lyrical in the chamber. I have to declare an interest in China, and that is, I know a wee bit about the country. I worked and lived there for over a decade. I spent around 14,000 hours learning Mandarin Chinese, Putonghua, along with Shanghainese dialects. And I also hold 2 master's degrees on China, as well as currently on a part-time PhD in China-related studies. And unfortunately, over the last year, nearly all of the debate on China has been extremely one-sided, not multifaceted, and fails to see much more of the nuance that actually exists, and ultimately doesn't necessarily depict the country which I came to know, but it does have many problems that we are faced with. And I know even less about the Olympics, and having worked at the embassy during the Beijing 2008 Olympic Games as the Olympic and Paralympic attaché, and then helped promote our wonderful country to the Chinese during the London 2012 Olympiad, where I was based at the British Consulate in Shanghai. And from these experiences, my view is that we should not be boycotting the upcoming 2022 Winter Olympics, because it's more important now than ever for us to be pushing for as many people-to-people and governmental exchange as we can possibly do. I'm a firm believer in the UK being open to the world, as this is the only true way to maintain influence and project the interests of our people. The alternative is an introverted stance in international politics, which quite frankly reeks of a seeping of confidence in our ability to influence and attract on the ice rink of international affairs. And I saw this firsthand in 2012 with the story of Mr. Wu Changjiang, who wrote to me when I was at the British Consulate 2 months before the London 2012 Games, because he really wanted to go to London to see the Olympics. As in 1948, he was an Olympiad there. He was a basketball player playing for the Chinese team, and he actually went up against the British team. And we were able, through working with different partners, to get him on a plane. He was 88 years old at the time, to go to London, and he met with what was his arch nemesis at the time, a Mr. Lionel Price from the British team, who has sadly and subsequently passed away. And they spent the day together in London. They went to the London Eye, amongst other things, and it created so much goodwill between the peoples of the UK and of China, and was widely held as a bilateral success. And indeed, a British Chamber of Commerce report presented this week to the All-Party Parliamentary China Group made the point, and I paraphrase, that the resumption of travel and openness can help create opportunities to build common ground and enhance intercultural understanding. And this is exactly why we should be in attendance come February 2022. Now, today's debate, it also makes me think about why COVID kind of faff aside, that there is no real opposition to Tokyo hosting the Summer Olympics this month. And in the 1980s, when we think back, there was much anxiety about the economic rise of Japan, and especially from the United States. But then we think of the last 30 years, and Japan has not only maintained its position as a top 3 largest economy, but it has a soft power capability which is truly astonishing. And along with the UK and the USA, it can boast one of the most influential youth cultures on the planet. I can't help but feel that China can definitely take inspiration from its neighbour across the East China Seas. And it has done both before, actually, in terms of its economic model, sometimes known as the developmental model for economics. Now, certain developments obviously have not been helpful of late, including a tilt to a more aggressive tone in diplomatic engagement, sometimes referred to as wolf warrior diplomacy, nor indeed has the sanctioning of my colleagues in the House. And the sooner we can move away from such tools and tone of diplomacy, then the better. And I do welcome the arrival of Ambassador Zheng Ziguang to the UK, and I hope, if he happens to see this debate today, that he can work with our government to ensure an easing in tensions. There's a long way to go in terms of how China presents and communicates itself with the rest of the world. We must, however, ask ourselves, what would a boycott achieve? And in the case of the 2022 Olympics, many experts say that a boycott likely won't work and could make it even harder to gain concessions from China. Experts found that the boycotting of the 1936 Berlin Summer Games and the 1980 Moscow Summer Games didn't actually change the direction of state policy. I don't believe that a boycott will lead to China changing its policy in terms of its ethnic relations, and in particular with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang Autonomous Region, or Zhejiu. And if anything, the government may dig in further. No, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the only thing it will achieve is potentially some loss of face on the organisers' behalf, and those boycotting may feel virtuous for a few moments. Olympics shouldn't be politicised, but obviously they've always been a medium through which to see the ebbs and flows of international relations. However, if we cannot engage in healthy competition...
Order. Sorry, Mark. We'll have to leave it there. We'll have to move on. Sorry, you've had 7 minutes, and we now go to the video link. Christine, we have a glitch with the clock, as you may notice, so hopefully you've got another device there, but if not, just give your wonderful speech, and I will stop you after 7 minutes or so. Christine Jardine.
I'll do my best, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Thank you very much. And I would like to congratulate the Honourable Member for East Worthing and Shoreham in securing this crucial debate, because it's something which is about much more than it might appear at first sight. It's not about sport. It's not about the Olympic Games. It's about human rights, and sending a clear message to the government of China that we will not take part in what will be a celebration of their regime, because that, as he so clearly demonstrated, is exactly what it will become. We have already heard some amazing and erudite contributions, particularly from the Honourable Member for Tunbridge and Malling. While I have not been sanctioned in the same way as he and many other Honourable Members, my constituency of Edinburgh West is home to the Chinese consulate in Scotland. And in the past, it has been made clear to me that my comments and criticisms of the regime's actions in Xinjiang, Hong Kong or Tibet were less than welcome. Nevertheless, I wish to make it clear that I do not support any indication of this country's approval of China's action that might be inferred from the diplomatic support of their games. And I am someone who has always believed that politicians should not interfere in sport, and doubted, as the previous Honourable Member has said, that the value of sporting boycotts. But this summer, like so many others in these islands, I've been swept up in the amazing buzz and excitement which surrounded Wimbledon, Euro 22, and the anticipation of the Open Championship and of the Tokyo Olympics. Each of them a great celebration of sport, which brought so much happiness to so many young people in pursuit of the goals of sporting achievement, which have already been detailed. And so it should be with the Winter Olympics next year too. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I fear that it will not be. I'm in agreement with those who believe that it is not appropriate for a sporting celebration, and the Olympics in particular, with its declared high ideals and spirit, to be taking place in a country against a background of widespread human rights abuses and undermining of democracy, which is why I am in complete agreement with this motion here before us today. Indeed, I might be tempted to go even further. In July, just a few days ago, the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee released a report urging the UK government to partially boycott 22 Beijing Winter Olympics. Earlier in February of this year, my own party leader, Ed Davey, announced that our our party would call for Britain to boycott the 22 Beijing Winter Olympics over alleged ethnic cleansing against Uyghur Muslims who have been imprisoned and subjected to political re-education in Xinjiang. Who could have failed to be moved by the TV pictures last year of adults forced to kneel on railway platforms before being loaded onto trains to be taken to who knows where, and with intent that I do not even want to think about? At the same time, we see a threat to democracy in Hong Kong and the Chinese government failing to respect the joint agreement, which was a precursor to the end of British involvement in the territory in 1997. Against that background, for us to offer any official government backing for the Winter Olympics would be to send the wrong message to Beijing. It would be telling them that we are fine with their behaviour, that we will turn a blind eye to the reports of 1 million Uyghur Muslims in detention camps, that the democracy in Hong Kong we will not defend. I do not believe that is a message that we want to send. Listening to my honourable friend from Bath speak about what might now be regarded as sham of Beijing's opening ceremony, dazzling hypnotic sham. Do we want once again to provide such a promotional opportunity for a regime whose approach to human rights is such an antithesis of everything we believe in this country? Human rights, democracy, respect, a positive platform to show off, to display their regime in a positive light. I do not believe so. After my party leader, Ed Davey, made his call for a boycott, there were warnings that this might mean sanctions from the Chinese government. But to give in to that threat would be to give way to bullying, which is why I would go further and back the call by my honourable friend from Bath that we should go further. We should go further than the growing consensus in support of a diplomatic boycott and boycott the Olympics, the Winter Olympics in Beijing completely. We should not allow the Olympics to return to China until the regime begins to change, to respect human rights and democracy. It has been enough hand-wringing and prevarication. We need to learn from the mistakes of the past. The treatment of Uyghur women and children forced to undergo procedures that they feel they have no choice in meets the criteria for genocide as set out in the Genocide Convention. The Liberal Democrats want our government to send a message that the UK will stand up against such crimes against humanity. We will not indulge the Chinese government by offering diplomatic credibility to the Games. We will not help them promote the regime on a world stage. We will not support the Olympics in Beijing, and we do not believe this government should do so, and we would support the motion before us today.
Thank you very much. It's a 6-minute limit, therefore. Alexander Stafford.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Member for bringing this very important debate to the House. The Olympic Games use sport to bring nations together, guided by the core values of excellence, friendship and respect. The Games and its core principles hold a special place in the heart of Rother Valley, as Leslie Ward, a resident of Branson and Northern, represented Great Britain at our diving team at the Olympic Games in 1992, 1996 and 2000. Needless to say, everyone in Rother Valley is immensely proud of her. Now, the Olympic Charter's noble values are cherished in Rother Valley and across the world, which makes the International Olympic Committee's decision to award the Games to Beijing incredibly odd indeed. Outrage and horror in this place and around the world has rightly followed the reports of mass atrocity crimes in Xinjiang. The UK government and this Parliament cannot stand by and watch. The Foreign Secretary himself said of the CCP's actions in Xinjiang, I quote, "Internment camps, arbitrary detention, political re-education, forced labour, torture and forced sterilisation, all on an industrial scale. It is truly horrific, and we have a moral duty to respond." And in April, this House voted to declare that China's actions amount to genocide and crimes against humanity. So why are we in this situation even debating the Olympic Games next year? Now, the PRC is a cause of concern beyond Xinjiang too. Commercially, companies fear upsetting the Chinese government and Chinese consumers, so they'll often bend to Chinese demands. It is simply not right that British and American companies based in the UK and the US accept a diktat of a foreign dictatorship. The misuse of economic soft power is directed against sovereign states too. Australia has had tariffs imposed because of its refusal to toe the line. African nations are the victims of coercive economic neo-colonisation. The Belt and Road Initiative is a Trojan horse for debt trap diplomacy. And the distribution of the Chinese COVID-19 vaccines is being used as diplomatic leverage. and the Republic of China, Taiwan's remaining allies, are being financially induced to switch democratic recognition to the PRC. Elsewhere in business, the Chinese run roughshod over rules of intellectual property, copying Western technology and innovation. They manipulate the money and provide unfettered state aid to their industries and companies to put Western businesses at a disadvantage. And the recent Chinese government crackdown on Didi, Alibaba, Tencent demonstrates their international intention to control all aspects of Chinese life, threatening our citizens' data security and the competitiveness of Western companies. And it is clear that on COVID-19, the Chinese have not been fully open and cooperative with the international community. All of this is not to mention the PRC's disregard for the rules-based international order in treatment of Tibet, its aggression on the Indian border, its persecution of Chinese Christians, the Falun Gong, and other minorities, its militarization of the South China Seas, its threat to pause the Republic of China, its banning of pro-democracy candidates running in elections in Macau, and of course its outrageous and illegal national security law in Hong Kong trample on the rights of millions of British nationals. And in the UK alone, we face constant threats to our national security from cyber attacks, espionage, Chinese ownership of vital infrastructure and key companies, as well as the infiltration of our universities' institutions. In light of all this, Mr. Deputy Speaker, why is the global community acquiescing to the 2022 Winter Olympic Games being hosted in Peking? And why is the UK government even considering sending Chinese representatives to attend the Games? Now, the PRC uses international events, such as the Winter Games, to cultivate its image and bolster its legitimacy, both at home and abroad. We must not hand China a propaganda victory. Unless the PRC ends its oppression in Xinjiang and elsewhere, and lifts sanctions on British companies and individuals, we must consider action in relation to the Games. A possible option is one where Great Britain would still participate in Beijing, and we would still cheer the team on to glory, but no state officials would attend. Our stance would send a message to both Peking and the wider international community that the UK unequivocally stands against the horrendous crimes occurring in Xinjiang and elsewhere, and will ensure that Beijing realises they cannot commit these crimes without impunity. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I know time is short, but as a result of the PRC's conduct towards the United Kingdom, its own people, and the international community, we cannot and must not provide a veneer of diplomatic respectability to the Chinese regime. I call on the International Olympic Committee to look at moving the 2022 Winter Games from the PRC, and I urge the UK government to consider not sending official representation if the Games do go ahead in Beijing. I shall always celebrate and support the Great Britain Olympic team, but we must not celebrate or support the Communist Party of China that is currently oppressing people both in China and abroad. We must look at all and any options to stop this awful regime.
Can you just take it to 4:30? Nazrat Ghani.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I must put on record my thanks to the member for Rother Valley for cutting his speech short to allow me to speak this afternoon. I'm incredibly grateful to his generosity. I'm also grateful to my good friend, the member for East Worthing and Shoreham, for bringing this very important debate to the House. He has indeed been a very passionate and powerful campaigner on Tibet, Hong Kong, to the Uyghur, and his integrity on some of these key issues of the day continues to be a source of inspiration to all of us. Before my words are misinterpreted, I want to make it absolutely clear. I'm not generally for boycotts. That's not the kind of Conservative I am. I'm rising to speak in favour of a diplomatic boycott, which is very different to a sporting boycott. And a diplomatic boycott of the Olympic Games is nothing new, as has been mentioned in many speeches today. I also want to put on record that these Olympics will no doubt take place, and I will be supporting our British athletes and hoping they win gold at every competition that takes place. But that's very different, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to supporting the CCP as it sport washes what's happening in Xinjiang. Mr. Deputy Speaker, as you know, I'm one of the MPs sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party, not for committing gross human rights abuses or for being a terrorist or a warlord, unless my colleagues have something they wish to share about themselves, if they've been sanctioned too, but for rising to speak up against genocide. And if my government thinks that it has any way in persuading the CCP to conduct itself any differently to our values and our norms, then I'm afraid that it has lost the plot completely. If there's any confusion on what this House views on genocide, just 3 months ago, this Parliament took a decision based on the evidence. It was an unprecedented decision to unanimously declare that all 5 markers of genocide were being met at the hands of the CCP against the Uyghur in Xinjiang. Let me just remind people, of course one of the markers is killing members of a group, also causing seriously bodily or mental harm, inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction, in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births, and we know that with the forced sterilisation of Uyghur women, and the barbaric act that's taken place amongst Uyghur families when Uyghur children in their hundreds of thousands are separated from their parents. And this is what's taking place in China, and this is what they don't want us to talk about as these games take place. Of course, we're signatories to the 1948 Convention on the Crime of Genocide, which is why I would never use the word lightly. And before the Minister at the dispatch box has to hold that embarrassing position that only the UN can declare genocide, we know the UN is broken when it comes to preventing or let alone researching genocide when it comes to China. We should also reflect on what this House has said as well. We're not the only ones in the world who recognises that the evidence exists that genocide is taking place. Netherlands, Slovakia, Canada, Czech Republic have all held their own motions. And Biden's administration has continued to declare the situation in Xinjiang as an ongoing active genocide. And more importantly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I wondered if you could take a message back to Mr. Speaker in reflection on what the State Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, has said about the Olympic Games. She is on record to say that she is supporting a diplomatic boycott on those grounds. It would be maybe an opportune moment at some point for Mr. Speaker to let us know what his own position is, because somebody in this place has to reflect the view of this House. And unfortunately, I'm worried that the government may not be able to be bold enough to hold that line. My anxiety is that if we have diplomats and politicians attending the Beijing Olympics or the Genocide Olympics, as has been referred to as earlier on, it enables the CCP to sportswash what is happening in Xinjiang and also makes a mockery of everything that we stand for. When the Foreign Secretary talks about internment camps, arbitrary detention, political re-education, forced labour, torture and forced sterilisation on an industrial scale, what does it mean if we then turn up to these genocide Olympics? And I know it's difficult for government, but politics is about choices, and we at some point have to defend our values and our British laws. And actually a diplomatic boycott will have an impact and is a low-risk, high-reward way of establishing global Britain's values. As the Foreign Secretary has already been on record to say, we have a moral duty to respond, and we can by making sure we do not have diplomatic presence at the Olympics. And it's nothing new. I believe that the previous Prime Minister David Cameron did not attend the 2014 Winter Olympics following the country passing anti-LGBT laws. Let's remind ourselves that the CCP believes that homosexuality is a mental illness and they are killing or destroying millions of Uyghur people. So the situation is no better, but I would argue much worse, so we should not be turning up diplomatically at the Genocide Olympics. There is some anxiety that we can't take action unilaterally, but this is also a nonsense. Many parliaments around the world are currently debating or discussing or already putting motions in place to ensure that politicians and diplomats are turning up at these Olympics going forward. What's also quite exciting to note is how forceful and bold the Biden administration is being on this official. Very recently, just last night, they also moved a motion in the Senate to declare that all goods coming in from Xinjiang are slave labour goods, and they will be now blacklisted or not allowed to be imported into America. And these are the motions that we should be moving in this House, not having a position that says, on the one hand, this is an industrial scale version of human rights abuses, and on the other hand, saying there's nothing that we can do. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, politics isn't for the faint-hearted. Every decision has consequences, but a diplomatic boycott will enable us to stand by what this House believes and what our allies believe, that a genocide is taking place in Xinjiang. The Games last 16 days, or around 1.3 million seconds. That's a second for every Uyghur imprisoned, abused, forced into labour under President Xi. We as Global Britain have to make a stand. Do we stand by those oppressed, or do we stand by President Xi? What feels like a lifetime ago, the 1936 Olympics, which weren't boycotted and also did not stop the slaughter of millions of Jews. We cannot make the same mistake again. I urge this House to support this motion and push for a full diplomatic boycott of the genocide games, and I thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Video link. Gavin, I don't know if you got the message. Up to 8 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I also start by congratulating the Honourable Member for East Worthing and Shoreham for bringing this very important debate before us today, and to the Backbench Business Committee for granting it. We've heard a lot of fantastic speeches and a lot of great points made, and none more so than the closing remarks of the last speaker, who was an extra speaker, and we were very grateful to hear from her. Her closing remarks hit the nail on the head. But we've heard a lot recently from many about how sport and politics don't mix, and that, with all due respect, is rubbish. The international community came together, well, in the most part, and isolated apartheid South Africa from international sport until it gave full human rights to all its citizens. I say in the most part because there were still those who regurgitated that phrase, sport and politics don't mix, even while the rest of the world stood against obvious injustice and repression in South Africa. Of course, sport should be free of state interference or political parties or figures meddling in its day-to-day organisation, but that doesn't mean that we cannot apply political ideals such as human rights and liberal democracy when it comes to the governance of sport and where governing bodies choose to hold their events. Those ideals were thrown under a bus when it came to awarding the 2022 Winter Olympics to Beijing. Because we now know from leaked Chinese Communist Party documents that even before the Games were awarded in 2015, the Uyghur people were the target of systematic and brutal repression. The party's General Secretary called for a period of painful interventionary treatment, education and transformation. That education and treatment has involved up to 2 million people being detained, used as slave labour, forcibly sterilised, and the Muslim population forced to drink alcohol and eat pork as part of their so-called education. This is undisguised, unmitigated barbarity, the scale of which we haven't seen on this continent since the Second World War. These are crimes against humanity, which the rest of the world has a moral duty to stand up against and to deny the Chinese government's attempts to instead bask in the warm glow of international sport. So the SNP supports the calls for the UK government to withhold support for the event by sending any government officials, politicians or members of the royal family. Of course, as always, and as it should be, it is solely for the Olympic associations to take decisions about the attendance of athletes themselves. Indeed, we encourage the UK government and the international community to call out the egregious human rights abuses being committed against the Uyghurs and other minorities in Xinjiang. We note the international community did this most recently at the UN Human Rights Council. The UN Human Rights Commissioner or another independent fact-finding body must be given unfettered access to Xinjiang. The genocide in Xinjiang and the human rights abuses elsewhere must not escape an international response. In a report published last week, as has been referenced, the Foreign Affairs Committee called for big boy politics on China. Boycotting the Games was one of manifold recommendations it made to the UK government, which has so far dragged its feet on robust action on China. And last week, members of the European Parliament overwhelmingly passed a resolution calling on diplomatic officials to boycott the 22 Winter Olympics in response to continuing human rights abuses by the Chinese government. It was passed by 578 votes to 29 and was supported by all of Europe's mainstream political groups, including the centre-right European People's Party, the group of the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and the centrists of France's Emmanuel Macron. The resolution calls for EU officials and member states to decline all government and diplomatic invitations to the Winter Olympics unless the Chinese government demonstrates a verifiable improvement in the human rights situation in Hong Kong, the Xinjiang Uyghur region, Tibet, Inner Mongolia and elsewhere in China. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, Mr Deputy Speaker, when asked the boycott question recently said, "I am instinctively and always have been against sporting boycotts." That's not the question that was asked of him, or what the motion before us seeks. As we saw during the back and forward with the genocide amendment of the trade bill, this government can't be trusted to stand up for human rights when push comes to shove. The global community failed to stand up against the human rights abuses in past that have coincided in time and location with prominent sporting events, and that mistake should not and must not be repeated. The UK government has a moral responsibility to diplomatically boycott the Games, which in many ways will be used as a propaganda tool for a regime committing genocide. It must be remembered that the CCP is a master of propaganda. So it seems pretty clear that from speeches today and various other remarks outside this chamber that the government is somewhat isolated in its thinking. That being said, we do support the UK's action to sanction Chinese government officials for crimes committed in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. The SNP welcomed the UK government's decision to begin to impose Magnitsky-style sanctions, but there are few Chinese leaders involved in abuses on the current list. And a report by the Foreign Affairs Committee notes that the government's current framework of UK policy towards China reflects an unwillingness to face this reality of widespread and merciless state-sanctioned abuse. Wider trade sanctions are necessary to avoid UK corporate and consumer complicity and to hit the Chinese economy. As the US have done, the government should ban the import of all cotton products known to be produced in whole or in part in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China, in line with WTO rules. We also believe this ban should be extended to other industries where abuses are known to be taking place, namely in tomato, PPE and solar panel production. The Department for International Trade should also publish an urgent review of export controls that apply to Xinjiang, because currently we have no import controls whatsoever in place to prevent goods from Xinjiang arriving on our shelves, despite the Prime Minister's claim to the contrary. Mr Deputy Speaker, it's sad in a debate about the Winter Olympics. I'd much rather be concentrating on the sport itself. The athletic endeavour, the sheer hard work the athletes have put in over the previous 4 years in preparation for the competition. Of course, this country hasn't had the success in the winter version of the Games as in summer, but I well remember growing up, the exploits of Rona Martin, our team's curling rink in Salt Lake City, Torval Dean, or the comeback, because I'm too young to remember the initial Bolero dance in 1984, I think, and of course the exploits of Eddie the Eagle and many others. But sadly, because of the appalling situation in Xinjiang, alongside the Chinese government's gradual erosion of civil liberties in Hong Kong, and what we already know about the decades-long suppression of democracy and freedom of expression in China, and an incomprehensible decision by the IOC, we're talking about something far different and far darker. But when the current IOC president says that his organisation must stay out of politics, an echo of his Francoist predecessor and all of those who supported apartheid South Africa's supporting links with other countries, we can see the challenges those who support human rights and dignity are up against. The IOC website has the temerity to claim that at all times the IOC recognises and upholds human rights as enshrined in both the fundamental principles of the Olympic Charter and the IOC Code of Ethics. Mr Deputy Speaker, only an institutionally arrogant organisation can make those claims and yet award next year's Games to China. But this isn't just an issue for the IOC. Too many international governing bodies have been happy to turn a blind eye to repression and state-sponsored violence when they choose who to host their latest event. One only has to remember the uproar when FIFA awarded World Cups to Russia and Qatar. And in conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, I do fear that we, or rather the IOC and sports governing bodies, are too far down the track for next year's Winter Olympics to be moved, but that should not stop future bids for Olympics and other major sporting events from being assessed not just on their stadia capacity or segregated car lanes for VIPs, but on their human rights record and their treatment of their own citizens. History shows that the IOC have not been fussy in the past about who leads them. Installing a senior member of Franco's phalange as their president should still be a source of shame, but they have a chance in future games to properly incorporate human rights into any assessment of candidate cities in future and put humanity rather than cold hard cash at the heart of sport.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'd firstly like to congratulate and thank the Honourable Member for East Worthing and Shoreham for putting forward his motion today and for securing this important debate. Today I want to set out the Labour Party's position on the genocide which is taking place in Xinjiang. According to all the available evidence we have, it is happening, and to also set out why we wholeheartedly support the motion that is before the House today. In a little over 6 months, the global spotlight will fall on Beijing as the city plays host to the 22 Winter Olympics. The Games should be a celebration of sporting achievement and a powerful symbol of our shared humanity. But next year's event will take place under a dark shadow. There is now an extensive and undeniable body of evidence pointing to the relentless state-sponsored persecution of the Uyghur Muslim minority in Xinjiang province. Mass detention of more than 1 million people, first-hand accounts of forced labour camps, enforced separation of children from parents, and harrowing reports of forced sterilisation. We've heard first-hand testimonies from brave Uyghur women speaking out about their experiences. important in-depth research from academic Adrian Zentz, which uses the Chinese government's own publicly available data on Xinjiang's population change. And who can forget the film shown to the former Chinese ambassador on the Andrew Marr show of shaven-headed, blindfolded Uyghur men being hoarded onto trains by Chinese officials at gunpoint. The evidence is both compelling and overwhelming, and until the Chinese government allows UN investigators full and unfettered access to Xinjiang to carry out their investigations, this is the evidence that we in this House and this government must use as the basis for our opinions and subsequent actions. In April, it was this evidence that led this House to determine that genocide was being committed against the Uyghur people, a matter upon which the benches opposite were shamefully instructed to abstain by the government. Now we're approaching the point at which a decision must be made regarding the Beijing Winter Olympics. There are some who would argue that politics and sport should not mix, but from NFL star Colin Kaepernick taking the knee, to Marcus Rashford shaming the government into U-turning on free school meals, to the England football team's united stance against divisive dog whistle politics this week, we have seen that many issues do transcend the divide between sport and politics. And this is not a new phenomenon. We only need to look back to the 1980s, when the sporting world played an integral role in piling pressure onto the South African government to end its racist apartheid agenda. Now, I'm not sure how honourable members on the benches opposite feel about this, given the position that then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher took on the matter. But as a huge British and Irish Lions rugby fan, and as an internationalist, I still feel tremendously proud of the stance that the Lions took. Their refusal to tour South Africa throughout the 1980s is irrefutable evidence of the power of sport to deliver progress and positive change. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, now is the moment to harness that lion spirit and to send a clear message to the Chinese Communist Party that oppression and discrimination can never be tolerated. Today, Labour is calling for a political and diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Games, as set out in a letter from my honourable friends, the Shadow Foreign Secretary and Shadow Culture Secretary, to their opposite numbers on the 7th of July. The Olympic Games have, of course, become a symbol of our global interconnectedness, bringing together athletes from across the world to compete under the Olympic values of excellence, respect and friendship. At their best, they are a testament to sport's ability to bridge divisions of culture, language, geography and race. Yet while many sports people have chosen to use their platform to show solidarity or to amplify the message of causes and movements, it would be wrong to expect them to sacrifice years of hard work and dedication to make up for the inaction and failings of their government. Nor would calling for a sporting boycott or calling for the cancellation of the 22 Games be fair on the Chinese people, who are not responsible for the atrocities being committed by their government. We need to be absolutely clear that Britain stands in solidarity with the Chinese people against oppression, and that this solidarity can be strengthened by enhanced cultural understanding between Western and Chinese people and communities. And this is why a political and diplomatic boycott is without doubt the position that this government must adopt. Over the past year, along with international allies, the UK government has rightly supported calls from the United Nations for unfettered access to Xinjiang in order to conduct a full investigation into the treatment of the Uyghur. Yet China has remained unmoved. Now, that's not to say that the UK government's demands have been particularly strong. As so often is the case with this Conservative government, strong rhetoric is yet to be matched with meaningful action, and I'll come back to that in my questions to the Minister shortly. But on the assumption that access to Xinjiang will not be granted by the 14th of September, which is the start of the next United Nations General Assembly, Labour has made clear that no member of the royal family, no UK politician or no senior official should attend the Games, as we cannot expect those individuals to be put in a position where they are serving to legitimise attempts by the Chinese government to sportswash, to take the Honourable Lady's phrase, the genocide that is being perpetrated against its own people. In short, sending royals or officials to Beijing in February would not be fair on those individuals, would not be right for our country, and would be a betrayal of the Uyghur people. Today's debate in Parliament is an opportunity for this House and Government to take a clear and unambiguous stance against the atrocities being committed by the Chinese government by supporting today's motion. So I urge all on the benches opposite to act in support of this motion and to send a clear message about what kind of country we are, a nation that stands against genocide and for human rights. It is clear that the Conservative benches are divided on this issue, and I commend any honourable member opposite who takes a stand against the government's weak approach on China, which is rooted in the type of naivety and complacency that have epitomised the Conservative government's approach, successive Conservative government's approach over the past decade, from the so-called golden era to the present day. So with this in mind, I have the following questions for the Minister. Does he think it is right that the Prime Minister is set to put members of the royal family and by association Her Majesty the Queen in the awkward and uncomfortable position of appearing to endorse a regime that is responsible for genocide? Why is the government doing all it can to avoid votes in Parliament on China? Is it because it recognises that it's on the wrong side of public opinion and on the wrong side of opinion in this House? What recent pressure has the government put on the Chinese government to allow UN investigators to enter Xinjiang province? Where are the Magnitsky sanctions on Chen Quanguo? It's been a full 6 months since the Foreign Secretary supposedly announced a supposedly urgent review into export controls on UK products sold into Xinjiang. When will we be seeing that report? When will the government make genuine substantive legislative changes to the Modern Slavery Act that will toughen up supply chain due diligence? Will the Minister send a clear message that by the time of the next UN General Assembly meeting, that China must not only have granted full and unfettered access for the UN to Xinjiang, but must also remove the entirely unjust sanctions that have been placed on members of this House and of the other place by the Chinese government? And will he take steps to ensure that China is not awarded the 2030 World Cup, bidding for which begins in June 2022? Mr. Deputy Speaker, if global Britain is to mean anything, it should mean upholding our values and defending human rights, no matter where in the world they are under threat. For too long, the government's been naive, complacent and inconsistent in its approach to China. Today's debate should be a turning point that leads to actions, not words. To do otherwise would be to hand the Chinese government the propaganda coup that they crave, at the expense of our country's reputation and obligations. A genocide is taking place in Xinjiang. This government now has a choice. Is it going to look the other way and send senior representatives to Beijing in February, or is it going to take a stand and understand that sending those representatives would be a betrayal of our values? Mr. Deputy Speaker, enough is enough. It is time to draw a line in the sand. We on these benches recognise this, and that is why we shall be supporting this motion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And can I start by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for East Worthing and Shoreham, for securing this debate, which has had some passionate and well thought through speeches throughout the afternoon. I'm very grateful to all honourable members, right honourable members, for their contributions, and further on in my remarks, before I hand back to the honourable member, I will try and respond to as many of the points raised as possible. But on the substantive issue of whether there should be a diplomatic boycott of the 2022 Winter Olympic Games, as I've made clear at this dispatch box a couple of weeks ago at oral questions, and as the Prime Minister has previously made clear, no decisions have yet been made about UK government attendance at those Winter Olympics in Beijing. And one or two members have mentioned that they wouldn't like to see the Games go ahead at all, and the participation, of course, of Team GB at the Olympics and Paralympics is a matter for the British Olympic Association and the British Paralympic Association. They operate independently of government, as is absolutely right, but this is also required by International Olympic Committee regulations. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this government has consistently been clear about the serious concerns we have about the human rights situation in Xinjiang. And in response, we have taken robust action, has been pointed out by a number of honourable and right honourable members. We've led international efforts to hold China to account for the gross human violations in Xinjiang. We have imposed sanctions on those responsible. We've announced a package of robust domestic measures to help ensure that no British organisations are complicit, including through their supply chains. And the Foreign Secretary has consistently raised our concerns directly with Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, most recently at the end of May. He has also, on the 22nd of March, announced asset freezes and travel bans under our global human rights sanctions regime. This is against 4 Chinese government officials and 1 entity who we believe are responsible for the gross human rights violations in Xinjiang. Mr. Deputy Speaker, importantly, these measures were coordinated alongside sanctions from the United States, Canada and the European Union. I know the Honourable Member for Bath referenced that we should be working alongside the European Union. We have done, and that's why we've delivered those sanctions alongside the EU. And we believe this has sent a clear message to the Chinese government that the international community will not turn a blind eye to such serious and systematic violations of basic human rights. So it speaks for itself that while 30 countries were united in sanctioning those responsible for these violations, China's response was to retaliate against its critics, a number of whom are in the chamber today. As the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary have made clear, China's attempts to silence those highlighting human rights violations at home and abroad, including their targeting of my right honourable and honourable friends and peers here in the UK, is completely unwarranted and unacceptable. The freedom to speak out in opposition to human rights violations is fundamental, and this government stands firm with all those who have been sanctioned, including my honourable friend, the member for East Worthing and Shoreham, and other honourable and right honourable members. And on that issue, I summoned China's representative in the UK to the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office on the 26th of March, where I lodged this strong formal protest at the actions of China. The sanctions we imposed in relation to Xinjiang followed the Foreign Secretary's announcement on 12th of January of a series of measures in respect of UK supply chains. These measures, which included a review of export controls, the introduction of financial penalties for organisations that fail to comply with their obligations under the Modern Slavery Act, and robust guidance to UK businesses on the risks faced by companies with links to Xinjiang, will help ensure that no British organisations, government or private sector, deliberately or inadvertently profit from or contributing to human rights violations against the Uyghurs or other minorities. We've also consistently taken a leading international role in holding China to account, and we've used our diplomatic influence to raise the issue up the international agenda. Mr. Deputy Speaker, on the 22nd of June, a global UK diplomatic effort helped deliver the support of 44 countries for a joint statement at the UN Human Rights Council. This underlined our shared concerns and called on China to grant unfettered access to the region for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. The growing caucus of countries expressing concern about the situation in Xinjiang sends a powerful message about the breadth of international opinion. And this is a caucus of international countries calling out China's actions, which has grown from 23 countries to 44 countries in just over a year. And it's a tribute. And I pay tribute to the UK's diplomatic leadership, including our network across the globe, the Foreign Secretary's influence with his counterparts, and under our G7 presidency, both G7 leaders and foreign and development ministers registered strong concern about the situation in Xinjiang. We'll continue to work with partners across the world to build the international caucus of those willing to speak out against China's human rights violations and to increase the pressure on China to change its behaviour. Now, I'd like to turn to some of the points raised by honourable and right honourable members. The member for East Worthing and Shoreham, in his powerful and eloquent speech, made a very, very strong case. I thought it was a little unfair on one of my heroes, Sir Paul McCartney, when he sang at the opening of the London Games. But he also raised the issue of sanctions alongside the honourable member for Manchester Gorton and others, including my honourable friend, the member for Rother Valley. And it speaks volume, Mr Deputy Speaker, that while we join the international community in sanctioning those responsible for human rights abuses, the Chinese government sanctions its critics. So if Beijing wants to credibly rebut claims of human rights abuses in Xinjiang, it should allow the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights full access to verify the truth. This is a point I note has been agreed with by the honourable member for Aberavon. He also meant I will once. I'm just conscious I've got to get through.
I don't want to give him away. I don't want to hold him very long because he's in the last part of his speech. But I have, on 2 occasions in the last 4 weeks, with regards to slave labour chains and supply in Xinjiang, on 2 occasions the Prime Minister has, from that dispatch box, said that the UK government has import sanctions, import controls on those who are suspected of being suppliers through that chain. I have asked a series of questions of both his and the Trade Department, and the one answer that comes back from the Trade Department is they have no import controls and they have no plans to make any. Could you tell me what government policy is towards import controls?
We're making good progress. Our guidance to businesses is being updated. We've launched a regular programme of ministerial engagement with businesses and trade bodies, but he will understand that much of this work is incredibly complex, and it does require the introduction of new legislation, and also coordination with our international partners. The honourable member for East Worthing and Shoreham also raised the issue, as did the member for Stockport and Chingford and Wood Green, the issue of Tibet. We're deeply concerned at reports of coercive control, restrictions on freedom of religion or belief, labour transfer schemes in Tibet. We've drawn attention to the human rights situation there, including most recently in a ministerial statement at the UN Human Rights Council. I'm going to be timed out, I'm afraid, Mr Deputy Speaker. I had a number of points to respond to honourable members. I want to thank all honourable members. If I could just raise the honourable lady member for Bath wonders whether we should go further and have a full boycott of the Games. We're clear that the participation of the national team is a matter for the British Olympic Association and the Paralympic Association. She also mentioned the amendments to IOC Rule 50, forbidding athletes to protest. This again is a matter for the BOA and other national Olympic committees to agree. Let me end, Mr Deputy Speaker. No decisions have yet been made about ministerial travel to the Beijing Winter Olympics. And if there is a division on this motion today, the government will therefore abstain. But our approach to China remains clear-eyed and rooted in our values and our interests.
Last word, Tim Loughton.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to the Minister and all the honourable and right honourable members who've made such impassioned speeches here today. And I think we've spoken virtually as one voice, although I'm sure that my honourable friend for Bolton North East would want to put in on record that he's a funding patron of the UK National China Committee. But we've had great phrases: sports washing, the genocide Olympics it will become known as, the veneer of diplomatic respectability. And let's reinforce, our argument is not with the people of China, it is with the murderous regime, the Chinese Communist Party government. I'm glad no decisions have been made so far. I do hope that the Minister will take very seriously the clear words that he's heard here today. Can I very gently, to the spokesman for the opposition, say that the enemy are not other Democrats in this House. He's had a pop at the government on several occasions. The enemy is the government of China, who is abusing its own people, and to go back to those principles of Olympism, that the enjoyment and rights and freedoms set out in the Olympic Charter should be secure without discrimination such as race, colour, sex, sexual orientation, language, religion, political or other opinion. It is the people of China who are not allowed to have those privileges. It is for them we are standing up, which is why we need a diplomatic and political boycott to make that point loud and clear, and I hope this motion will be passed by the House today.
The question is as on the order paper. As many as that please say aye. Aye. Contrary no? I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn, and whilst we're waiting for Stephen Timms to come on the video link, the dispatch box will be sanitised, so I know that the Minister will